first time here, so it's really great. I really enjoy the opportunity to be here. And so I want to talk about something that I think is very interesting about, as I think a lot of you know, quantum mechanics is something that's extremely very difficult to understand. It suggests all kinds of paradoxes, and there are many sort of alternative explanations, and no one's really quite sure, or so far there's no consensus. And one of the things that I think may be a good way to sort of break through this is to kind of like look at anomalous data, especially data that has anomalies, especially with respect to consciousness, because some of the theories of, because quantum mechanics does have a kind of link with consciousness, I think. So as far as the puzzle of quantum mechanics, it, for the most part, revolves around a what's called the measurement problem. Let me just see. And the measurement problem, as you're probably aware, in the standard formulation, there's a standard waveform. The Schrodinger equation sort of governs the evolution of the system. And then this changes when a measurement occurs to reveal the results of whatever the results of the experiment. But nobody really has a good idea about how to kind of formally describe exactly how a measurement of some kind changes or causes the transition from the waveform to the experimental results. So all the theoretical explanations that have been offered seem to, or at least many of them, seem to conflict with sort of our common sense reality. And that so far there's no consensus on the answer. So as you're probably aware, the conventional interpretation suggests a kind of quantum superposition, even at macro states. Schrodinger sort of formulated his thought experiment where a cat might be simultaneously alive and dead to suggest that there was something about the standard formulation that was kind of problematic and sort of clashed with our sense of reality. Another interpretation is the sort of the many whirls. This comes from the idea that if we don't really worry about the measurement problem, we can just say that the Schrodinger equation captures all the information of all possible quantum states. Therefore, every time there's a quantum event of some kind, the universe splits into different possible worlds or possible universes. So we might actually have be a multiverse where they're made up of an infinity number of universes. So given these kinds of maybe rather unpalatable kinds of visions, I'd like to suggest that we sort of return to this role of consciousness. Now, as you all probably know, some of the early founders of quantum mechanics did suspect that consciousness played a role. And it's not exactly something that, I mean, the Copenhagen interpretation, as von Neumann illustrated, does kind of suggest the possibility that consciousness might be involved in some way. And while it's generally dismissed or not given too much weight among physicists, some, such as Henry Stapp, still advocate it today. So a lot of what's missing, I think, from this discussion is what's been happening in among philosophers of mind, talking about, asking what is consciousness? How do we experience anything? The problem is that, first of all, there's no real consensus theory on how consciousness happens. Second, when we look closely at the laws of physics, there's nothing in the laws of physics that suggests or even hints how non-conscious particles, such as electrons and atoms and so forth, become conscious. Okay? So therefore, the only thing really that might, in physics so far, that suggests a link between mind and matter is actually this kind of some interpretations in quantum mechanics that suggest that that consciousness has a role in maybe collapsing the waveform. So if we exclude this from the discussion, it seems like we're making the hard problem even harder. The only thing in physics that has a suggestion, we're sort of like kind of like maybe not examining perhaps as much as we should. Another important point, too, is that these alternative explanations, they're kind of theoretical constructions that kind of clash with our reality, but consciousness is something we experience directly. So we don't have to worry about whether it exists or not. So I think that for a number of reasons, that's something that we should consider. Also, as Dean and Roger and many others have accumulated a lot of very interesting evidence that does suggest some sort of mind-matter interaction, significant effects. There's a very robust meta-analysis for a number of categories of psi, including telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition, presentiment. And there may be some debate about some of the mind-matter interaction, but I think that the replication issues can be most likely explained by using explanations that are actually very consistent with mind-matter interaction, such as the experimenter effect. So I don't want to say too much more about this due to the limitations of time. I assume many of you are already aware of this literature, and if not, just simply allow me to assume that there is this literature that exists. So also, I'm not going to say a whole lot about the different possible explanations of quantum mechanics. I'd like to focus on three that I think are mostly, that there is some link with consciousness and quantum mechanics. These are not ad hoc sorts of explanations to explain psi. These are actually explanations that have been used to sort of explain the experimental data in quantum mechanics, but also happen to be very interesting and have been cited in the psi literature as well. So so there's actually the wave collapse approaches. There's actually sort of an observer emphasized. Originally, Wigner is associated with it, but recently Stapp. Objective reduction doesn't involve a observer, so it's a sort of a more sort of a objective collapse. And then there's what Bohm and Hiley, and also I think Stapp has sort of contributed a little bit in this area too, is sort of a way that maybe you have a way of explaining quantum mechanics without the collapse, maybe with a more realistic ontology, but using sort of like implicate orders or hidden orders or non-local and holistic features. Okay, so so with the subjective waveform collapse, in this case we have sort of it's pretty much very similar to the standard Copenhagen interpretation, but it's basically we just sort of like posit that there is an observer that is sort of causing the collapse. Okay. So that means that reality isn't some kind of quantum superposition until an observation occurs. Now, this, of course, raises, as you're probably aware, this raises a lot of ontological questions about what happens to reality when there's not an observer. What happens on the other side of in a far distant galaxy, or when in the universe before humans existed, okay? Also, this has been sort of invoked to sort of defend a sort of a dualism or dualistic version of reality, because often dualism is hard to explain if you posit there's two fundamentally different sort of versions of reality, matter and mind. This kind of interpretation does lend itself at least to a possible dualistic point of view. Okay. So how do we kind of like maybe tell this story? Use this story to make sense of the psi data. Well, Homer might be in a quantum superposition. He might have an alternative reality or a possibility where he moonlights as Batman. Lisa observes Homer. Perhaps she has an intention that Homer sort of like stays at home, and therefore this sort of intention might bias the probabilities in a way that sort of collapses Homer into the Homer that she's more familiar with. And if we also suggest that mind maybe has some non-local attributes in this kind of more dualistic version of mind is not necessarily just a material thing, perhaps Lisa and Milhouse share a sort of telepathic link. Okay, so So therefore, we might be able to account using this kind of idea, mind-matter interactions as conscious intention might influence the direction of the collapse of the probabilities within the standard waveform. And it may be consistent with telepathy, too, if consciousness is non-local. However, in my view, it seems to be an awkward fit with clairvoyance. For example, what happens in remote viewing experiments? Does that count as an observation? If so, it may be that, especially if clairvoyance is associated with a lot of unconscious parts of the mind, it may be that we're sort of like unconsciously causing sort of these collapses of the waveform. Okay, and therefore the idea of what's observation might be kind of ambiguous. Also, it seems to be kind of an awkward fit with presentience and precognition. If we're, let's say, observing some future event, does that mean that we're causing a collapse of that future event? But of course, the way the theory works is that the collapse is instantaneous. So it seems like it would require us to make maybe a deviation from the current theory. Also, I'm not sure that it can account for the Global Coherent Project. That data suggests that participants influencing random number generator devices through shared emotions are not aware of those devices. So they're actually having an effect, perhaps collapsing the quantum mechanical probabilities into ones and zeros, shifting the probability distributions, but not being aware of it suggests that that's also another deviation from the effect. Okay, so I'd like to talk about the next one. Another category possibility is, I don't really know what the best term is, but they're kind of like more realistic ontological explanations involving some sort of deeper hidden order. Okay, so Bowman-Hiley posit a kind of implicate order of active information, which guides subatomic particles in ways that conform with the experimental evidence, but without requiring a collapse. And so this might be a version of neutral monism, where mind and matter are aspects of an underlying neutral substance. Okay? And so this gives a more realistic ontology rather than a collapse or sort of many worlds story. This more realistic ontology is achieved through a sort of non-reductionist, a holistic order that has a lot of non-local features. And Stapp also draws on Whitehead's process ontology and develops a sort of a framework that sort of posits a potentia that is a foundation for reality, which I think is a similar kind of story. Okay, so I'd like to sort of like express the story in the following way. Okay, suppose that we have a kind of underlying deeper order, a foundational neutral order with sort of like a pure potentia, where sort of a precursors of both mind and matter. In this case, there's no collapse. Homer and Lisa there's sort of there may be some sort of like ways that Lisa and Nelson share their Milhouse share some of their thoughts without requiring a kind of any kind of waveform collapse. So I believe that this story does sort of like give a story that's consistent with all the various kinds of psi categories that I've described earlier. For example, telepathy and clairvoyance can be understood as perceptions that underlie the information and probabilities of events and experiments. Presentiments and presentience and precognition can be understood as perhaps unconscious perceptions of current probabilities of future events. Mind-matter interaction can be understood as mental intentions influencing the probabilities of standard waveforms. And the Global Coherence Project can be understood as shared emotions affecting the underlying probabilities of quantum mechanical processes. So the next category is Hameroff and Penrose's theory of quantum computing in the brain. And this has received a lot of attention because they have a lot of ways that, in their theory, is integrating with the neurophysiology. I can only sort of briefly describe some of the sort of bare bones aspects of the theory. Penrose suggests that quantum gravity interacts with quantum superposition to create an objective reduction of the waveform. So a conscious observer is not required. And this objective reduction, this process, leads to a rudimentary level of consciousness, even among rocks or anywhere out in the physical world where this objective reduction is occurring, which is ubiquitous. Now, within the brain, conscious experience, there are these, they describe the process as a lot more structured and organized within the microtubules, within the neurons. So we have the microtubule, these very microscopic cylinders, which are actually within the neurons, which in turn create this sort of very rich network of sustained quantum superposition. And what they argue is when the collapse occurs in a recurrent way, that we experience conscious experience. So in this case, we may be able to account for telepathy and clairvoyance if the objective reduction process incorporates non-local information. So it may be that in the sort of the precursors of consciousness, there's quantum entanglements with the environments, and therefore we can sort of like then when we're conscious, we sort of like have some awareness of that non-local information. And Hameroff and Penrose also speculate that their framework can account for some of the temporal anomalies, such as presentience and precognitive experimental results. I'm not clear whether this gives us an easy story to support telekinesis. The direction of causation of the objective reduction suggests that physical processes create consciousness. Now, to be fair to them, they do argue that their objective reduction, or the orchestrated objective reduction in the mind, does create a kind of free will, or creates or supports free will. But it seems to me that when we're conscious, we're not sort of in that quantum entanglement that seems to support, that would maybe support a sort of, mind over matter over distances. Also, it may not be able to account very well for the Global Coherence Project results, where participants influence random devices without being aware of them. Okay, so as a conclusion, I would say that examining the psi data can be very useful in making progress toward understanding quantum mechanics, and also, I think, in terms of helping us understand the hard problem of consciousness. Now, well, the frameworks that Bowman, Hiley, and Stapp have offered have often been marginalized and ignored, and currently not as integrated with neurophysiology. I think that it is a very interesting framework that seems to be consistent with all the psi data, at least the laboratory data that I mentioned earlier. Also, I think that the psi data seems to suggest non-local transfers of information rooted not just in the consciousness, but also in the subconscious, or the boundary of the two. And this may be problematic for theories of quantum mechanics that rely on sort of a conscious observation. So anyway, that's kind of my presentation. Thank you all very much.
We have a little time for questions.
Thank you very much. My name's Leslie Heyman, and I appreciated the overview that you provided and the questions, the observations you've brought up. On the last point about the interpretation of Hameroff and Penrose's microtubule theories and recent findings in and around their work would suggest that maybe we should be rethinking consciousness, and maybe this has implications for interpretation of quantum mechanics. They end up at the last, towards the Science of Consciousness conference, ended up having presentations of recent research findings which would indicate that the microtubules somewhat consistent with their theories, are basically vibrating. And so, in fact, the whole brain and inside the nerve cells, we've got what they talk about as clocks. Clocks within clocks, clustered within clocks. And then, in fact, the whole brain, our entire body, is vibrating and, as one scientist explained, a beautifully harmonic instrument that is exquisitely sensitive not only within itself to itself, but to the environment. So that at a subconscious level, it's perfectly possible to pick up information. There's all sorts of questions about how we do that in a logical or a coherent differentiating form, and the microtubules may help with that. But I think that your observations about the inconsistency between their theories, for example, and the global consciousness project, I would question that, because a lot of this, we're talking about consciousness as if it's a specific thing, a set of ideas, which I think is representative of the cognitive function, whereas in fact consciousness may be a vibrational harmonic effect that is less about specific words and cognition. So I just wanted to make that observation because I think you're opening up doors to conversations where there are more answers actually than you're allowing yourself and us to sort of see. But thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I was at the conference also, and it's very, very, very good presentations. And I think also Hamroff might, argue with, because I know he's very open-minded to a lot of possible interpretations. So thank you.
Thank you very much.